Captain Alara Ghost Vasquez never looked like the kind of soldier who would become a legend. She was lean, quiet, and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who listened more than she spoke and observed more than she reacted. In a world full of people who filled silence with noise, Alara filled it with attention. She noticed things, the way a person's hands moved when they were lying, the way wind shifted 3 seconds before weather changed, the way a helicopter sounded different when something was about to go wrong. These were not skills she was taught. They were instincts she had sharpened since childhood, because in the life she came from, missing small details had consequences. She was raised in San Antonio, Texas, in a neighborhood where the streets were cracked and the summers were brutal and nobody talked much about the future, because the present demanded too much energy. Her mother, Rosa Vasquez, worked double shifts at a highway diner 6 days a week, coming home with aching feet and flour on her forearms, and never once complaining about it in front of her daughter. Rosa never told Alara that life was hard. She simply showed her, every single day, what it looked like to carry hard things with dignity. That lesson embedded itself into Alara's spine like steel reinforcement poured into concrete. It would hold her upright in places and situations that would have collapsed anyone else. She was not a remarkable student in the traditional sense. She wasn't the girl who raised her hand first or won the spelling bees or got her name on the honor roll every semester. What she was relentless. If she didn't understand something, she stayed with it until she did. If she failed a test, she dissected every wrong answer like a mechanic pulling apart an engine, not out of shame, but out of determination to understand the mechanism of her own failure. Teachers remember her as the student who never asked for help, but never gave up either. She existed in that rare space between pride and perseverance, and she lived there comfortably. At 16, she saw a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter for the first time at an air show outside the city. She stood in the crowd while everyone else stepped back from the noise and the wind it kicked up, and she stepped forward. She stood as close as the barrier would allow, watching the aircraft hover and maneuver with an intensity that made the soldier operating the perimeter rope notice her. He asked if she was interested in aviation. She didn't answer right away. She just kept watching the helicopter. Then she said, quietly and with complete certainty, "I'm going to fly one of those." The soldier smiled the way adults smile when teenagers say things they don't believe. He had no idea she meant it with every cell in her body. At 19, she walked into a recruitment office with blistered hands from a summer construction job and a fire in her chest that no counselor or aptitude test had ever been able to fully measure. She enlisted, crushed every physical and academic standard placed in front of her, and pushed relentlessly toward flight school. The road was not smooth. There were officers who doubted her, training cycles that nearly broke her, and moments alone in barracks at night where exhaustion pressed down so hard it felt physical, like a hand on her chest. She got through all of it the same way Rosa had gotten through double shifts, quietly, stubbornly, and without asking anyone to make it easier. By 26, she was one of the most respected Medevac pilots in the United States Army, stationed at a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan with a combat record that made senior officers speak carefully and junior soldiers speak in something close to reverence. Her call sign, Ghost, was not given for mystery or theatrics. It was given because when she flew a Medevac mission, she moved with a silence and precision that felt almost supernatural, slipping in under fire, extracting the wounded, and disappearing back into the sky before the enemy could fully process what had happened. She was not a woman who invited admiration. She deflected it, redirected it, pointed it back toward her crew. But the admiration came anyway because real courage, the kind that isn't performed for anyone, has a way of making itself impossible to ignore. And on the night everything changed, all of it, every hard year, every sleepless training cycle, every lesson Rosa taught without words, was the only reason she survived. The call came in at 18:47 hours, and the operations center at Forward Operating Base Kestrel went from controlled tension to controlled urgency in the span of about 4 seconds. That was how it always happened, not with alarm bells or dramatic announcements, but with a shift in the room's energy, a tightening of postures around radio equipment, a sudden economy of words among people who moments before had been speaking freely. Everyone in that room knew what a Ranger distress call meant. It meant the situation on the ground had moved beyond what rifles and training could handle alone. It meant someone was dying. It meant the clock had already started. The report was sparse and brutal in the way combat reports always were. 4-man Ranger reconnaissance team, call sign Ironback, operating 12 kilometers northeast of the wire in the Cunnar River Valley. 2 soldiers critically wounded, one with a sucking chest wound indicating probable lung collapse, one with severe hemorrhaging from a lower extremity injury. The remaining 2 Rangers were combat effective, but pinned down by enemy fire from elevated positions on both flanks. Extraction by ground vehicle was assessed as too slow and too dangerous given the terrain and the enemy's positioning. The only viable option was air. The only aircraft configured and crewed for a hot medevac extraction was the Black Hawk sitting on the flight line with Captain Alara Vasquez's name attached to it. She was in the briefing room before the watch officer finished the second sentence. Not because she had been summoned, because she had heard the radio traffic herself from across the corridor and had already begun moving. She stood at the map table with her helmet under one arm and her flight gloves already on, studying the terrain overlay with the focused stillness of someone who was not preparing to make a decision, but had already made it and was now simply gathering the information needed to execute it well. The watch officer looked at her. She looked back at him. The conversation that passed between them contained no actual words. He nodded. She turned toward the flight line. Sergeant Damon Holt was already at the aircraft running pre-flight checks when she arrived. That was Holt, always one step ahead of the moment, always where he needed to be before anyone told him to be there. He was 29 years old, from a small town in rural Kentucky, and he had co-piloted with Vasquez on 11 previous missions. He knew her rhythms the way a musician knows a long-practiced piece, not by thinking about it, but by feel. He looked up from the checklist when she approached, read her expression, and said nothing beyond the essentials. There was no need. The aircraft told them everything that needed to be said about the seriousness of the next hour. Specialist Tanya Reeves was securing the medical kit in the rear cabin when Vasquez climbed into the cockpit. Reeves was the youngest of the 23, from Philadelphia, with quick hands and a calm that was almost unnerving in someone her age. She had a habit of humming quietly while she worked, low and tuneless, the kind of sound a person makes when their mind is completely occupied and their body is on autopilot. Vasquez could hear it faintly from the cockpit as the engines began to spool up, and the familiar sound of it settled something in her chest. Her crew was ready. Her aircraft was ready. The mission parameters were locked in her mind with the clarity of something carved rather than memorized. The Black Hawk lifted off at 19:03 hours into a sky the color of a bruise, the last thin line of sunlight bleeding out along the western ridgeline. The mountain air was cold and sharp, and the valley below was already lost in shadow. Vasquez climbed to altitude, set her heading, and scanned the instruments with the automatic rhythm of a pilot who had done this so many times that the aircraft had become an extension of her own nervous system. Holt managed the radio traffic. Reeves ran final checks on the medical equipment in the cabin behind them. For 17 minutes, everything was exactly as it should have been. The flight was textbook. The coordinates were confirmed. The Ranger team was still transmitting. The rescue was going to work. Then the sky behind them turned to fire, and nothing was ever routine again. The RPG hit the tail rotor at 19:21 hours, and the world inside the cockpit became pure violence in an instant. There was no warning, no radar alert, no muzzle flash visible through the cockpit glass, no fraction of a second in which the brain could prepare itself for what was coming. One moment the Black Hawk was cutting cleanly through cold mountain air at 4,000 feet, engines steady, instruments nominal, the distant lights of the valley floor visible far below. The next moment the aircraft convulsed like something alive and mortally wounded, a detonation tearing through the tail section, with a force that Vasquez felt not just through the airframe but in her teeth, in her chest, in the base of her skull. The tail rotor was gone. Not damaged, gone. Shredded into fragments that scattered into the darkness behind them like sparks off a grinder. Without the tail rotor's counterforce, the Black Hawk immediately began to rotate on its own axis, the torque of the main rotor spinning the fuselage in an ever-tightening clockwise revolution that the controls could no longer correct. The instrument panel exploded into warning lights, red and amber cascading across every display simultaneously, alarms screaming over the intercom, the aircraft vibrating with a frequency that was wrong in every way a helicopter could be wrong. Vasquez's hands moved instantly and without conscious thought, pulling every emergency procedure her body had been trained to execute before her mind had fully registered what was happening. It wasn't enough to stop the spin, but it was enough to slow it. Holt never had a chance. The shrapnel that came through the cockpit traveled faster than sound and faster than reaction, a jagged fragment of steel the size of a playing card entering through the fractured cockpit glass and striking him with a force and precision that no amount of training or armor or will could have altered. He was gone before the aircraft completed its first full rotation. Vasquez knew it the moment it happened, not from any instrument or visible confirmation, but from the sudden, terrible absence of him beside her. The co-pilot seat that had always contained a living, breathing, competent human being now contained something else entirely, and the cockpit felt larger and colder and more dangerous in a way that hit her somewhere beneath the professional and above the personal. She did not stop flying. Behind her, in the cabin, Specialist Reeves was thrown laterally across the interior with the full rotational force of the spinning aircraft. She struck the bulkhead with the left side of her head and the back of her neck at an angle that the human spine was never designed to absorb. The humming that Vasquez had heard during takeoff, that low, tuneless, focused sound, stopped. The medical kit Reeves had spent 20 minutes carefully organizing scattered across the cabin floor. The red tactical light mounted above the rear door swung on its bracket in violent arcs, throwing lurching shadows across everything. Vasquez called her name once over the intercom. Then again. The silence that answered was a kind of answer in itself. She was alone. 4,000 feet above the Afghan mountains, in a spinning, burning, tail-damaged Black Hawk with one dead co-pilot, one dead crew chief, a left shoulder that was screaming with pain where shrapnel had torn through it, and controls that were responding to her inputs with the sluggishness of something fighting its own destruction. She was completely, entirely, terrifyingly alone, and the mountain below her was not a metaphor. It was rock and altitude and darkness and physics, and it was coming up at a rate that her instruments, those still functioning, were measuring with cold mathematical indifference. Most people in that moment would have experienced something that the mind uses to protect itself from the unbearable, a narrowing, a numbing, a kind of merciful cognitive shutdown that removes a person from the full horror of what is happening to them. Vasquez experienced something different. She experienced clarity. Not the desperate, frantic clarity of panic, but the deep, focused clarity of a mind that had been built and trained and tested for exactly this kind of moment, and had decided without drama or negotiation that it was not finished yet. She pulled the collective. She corrected her heading. She began talking herself through every emergency auto-rotation procedure she had ever memorized, her voice low and even and steady in the empty cockpit, the words precise and sequential and calm. She was bleeding, she was spinning, she was 4,000 feet above certain death. And she was still flying. There is a specific kind of silence that exists inside a damaged aircraft at altitude, not the silence of quiet, but the silence of everything that should be making sound no longer making it correctly. The tail rotor was gone. The transmission was grinding against itself in a way that sent vibrations through the entire airframe like a living thing shuddering in its final moments. 2 of the 4 engine instruments were dark. The radio panel was partially destroyed. One of the 2 primary communication systems reduced to a tangle of burned wiring and shattered display glass. What remained was a helicopter that was technically still airborne in the same way that a man with 3 bullet wounds is technically still standing, present, functional in the most critical sense, but operating entirely on reserves that were depleting with every passing second. Vasquez assessed all of this in approximately 8 seconds, not because she was superhuman, but because assessment was the first discipline of survival, and she had practiced it so many times in training and in combat that it had become reflex rather than process. She knew what she had. She knew what she had lost. She knew what the aircraft could still do and what it could no longer be asked to do. And she knew, with the cold precision of someone doing math under fire, that she had a narrow window, measured not in minutes, but in decisions, to put the Black Hawk on the ground before the ground came up and took it on its own terms. The spin was the first problem. Without tail rotor authority, the main rotor's torque was rotating the fuselage continuously, and a spinning helicopter cannot be aimed, cannot be controlled in any meaningful sense, cannot be landed. It can only crash with varying degrees of violence. Vasquez adjusted the throttle with her right hand, reducing main rotor torque incrementally, simultaneously working the remaining cyclic authority to induce a forward translational movement that would use airspeed to partially counteract the rotation. It was a technique that existed somewhere between textbook emergency procedure and improvisation, something a flight instructor might have described theoretically, but would never have expected a pilot to actually execute alone, at night, bleeding, in a combat zone. It worked, partially. The spin slowed from a full continuous rotation to something more like a steep, aggravated yaw, still dangerous, still deeply wrong, but no longer the kind of uncontrolled revolution that made controlled descent impossible. She had bought herself something. Not safety, not even close, but possibility, and in the arithmetic of survival, possibility was everything. Her left shoulder was the next problem. The shrapnel had entered from the rear left, torn through the muscle and lodged somewhere she couldn't see and couldn't reach, and the arm below it was responding to her commands with a delay and weakness that told her the damage was serious. She could use the hand. She could grip. But the strength wasn't there, and she could feel warmth spreading down her sleeve in a way that she identified clinically and filed away without emotional engagement. She was bleeding. The rate mattered. She estimated she had time. She kept flying. The radio was the third problem, and in some ways the most isolating. The primary communications system was dead. The secondary was damaged but partially functional, capable of transmitting, she believed, but whether anything was getting through on the receiving end was unknown. She keyed the transmit button on the secondary with her right thumb, not releasing the cyclic but adjusting her grip to manage both simultaneously, and began transmitting in the clipped, precise language of military aviation emergency protocol. Call sign, aircraft type, nature of emergency, last known coordinates, heading, altitude. She repeated the sequence every 30 seconds, methodically, without urgency in her voice, because urgency in a transmission communicates panic and panic communicates to whoever is listening that the situation is beyond management. She did not want anyone to believe the situation was beyond management, including herself. At Forward Operating Base Kestrel, the signals intelligence officer on duty that night was a 24-year-old specialist named Aaron Griggs who had been awake for 19 consecutive hours and was running on cold coffee and professional obligation. He almost missed it. The transmission came through the secondary monitoring frequency at low strength, broken by static and interference, the words fragmenting in and out like a voice heard through water. He pressed his headset tighter against his ears. He reached over and turned the squelch down. He listened. He heard her call sign. He heard coordinates. He heard the word Mayday. He was on the command frequency before the transmission finished, his voice sharp and immediate in a way that cut through the background noise of the operations center and brought every head in the room up simultaneously. The watch officer crossed the floor in 4 strides. The Quick Reaction Force commander was called. A search and rescue team began assembling in the dark outside the flight line with the focused, rapid efficiency of people who understood that somewhere out in those mountains, someone was still alive, and the margin between still alive and no longer alive was measured in the speed of their response. No one in that operations center said out loud what most of them were thinking, that the transmission had been too broken, too weak, the coordinates too deep in hostile terrain for anyone to reasonably expect to find a living pilot at the end of them. No one said it because saying it would have made it real, and making it real would have slowed them down, and slowing down was something none of them were willing to do while Ghost was still transmitting. On the ground 12 kilometers northeast of the wire, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb pressed himself against a boulder with his rifle up and his wounded men behind him, and listened to the darkness above. He had heard the explosion 20 minutes earlier, a distant concussive thud that had rolled across the mountain peaks like thunder from the wrong direction. He had known immediately what it was. He had known immediately what it meant. And then, cutting through the wind and the intermittent crack of distant small arms fire, he had heard something that made him go absolutely still. Rotors, damaged, uneven, laboring against physics and gravity and everything that was trying to bring them to silence, but still turning, still cutting, still up there in the dark somewhere above him, refusing to come down. Webb lowered his rifle slightly. He tilted his head back and looked up into a sky full of stars and darkness, and the faint, wounded sound of a black hawk that should have been dead 20 minutes ago. And in a voice too quiet for any of his men to hear, he said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "Come on, Ghost. Bring it down." She found the canyon at 19:38 hours, 17 minutes after the RPG struck, and in the context of everything that had happened in those 17 minutes, finding it felt less like luck and more like the universe offering one single, narrow concession to a woman who had already refused to accept anything less than survival. It appeared below her through the cracked cockpit glass as a dark gash in the mountain terrain, a slash of deeper shadow against shadow, running roughly northeast to southwest between 2 ridgelines that rose on either side like walls built by something that had never intended the space between them to be used by anything living. It was narrow. It was littered with boulders she could see even from altitude as irregular shapes interrupting the flat darkness of the canyon floor. It was, by every measurable standard of aviation safety and tactical landing procedure, completely unsuitable as a landing zone. It was also the only option she had left. The fuel warning had activated 4 minutes earlier, a steady amber pulse on the instrument panel that she had noted and catalogued and set aside the way a surgeon sets aside the awareness of their own fatigue during a critical procedure. Acknowledged, filed, not permitted to influence the hands. The main rotor transmission was making a sound now that she had never heard in training or in combat, a deep metallic grinding that she could feel through the collective as much as hear through the airframe, the sound of mechanical components operating far beyond the tolerances they had been engineered to survive. She had perhaps 3 minutes of marginally controlled flight remaining, possibly less. The mountain below her had no opinion about any of this. She began her approach. What she did in the next 90 seconds existed at the intersection of training, instinct, and something that the people who later analyzed the flight data recorder would struggle to categorize using the language of standard aviation procedure. She reduced throttle to lower main rotor torque and minimized the yaw that had been fighting her since the tail rotor was destroyed. She used the forward cyclic to trade altitude for airspeed, building just enough translational lift to give herself a degree of directional control that pure auto-rotation at this speed and configuration should not have provided. She was simultaneously managing a damaged collective with a left arm that had perhaps 40% of its normal strength, reading the canyon floor through cracked glass in near-total darkness, and calculating a touchdown point among boulders using nothing but a red-filtered cockpit light and 17 years of accumulated spatial awareness. The canyon walls came up on both sides as she descended, narrowing her already impossibly narrow margins further with every foot of altitude she surrendered. The wind between the ridgelines was channeled and unpredictable, hitting the damaged airframe in lateral gusts that each threatened to push her into rock. She corrected for each one. Not smoothly, there was nothing smooth about any part of this, but effectively, with the stubborn, incremental corrections of someone who understood that perfection was no longer available and adequacy, barely achieved, would have to be enough. At 50 feet above the canyon floor, she could see the boulders clearly. At 30 feet, she identified the longest continuous stretch of relatively flat ground available, perhaps 40 meters, strewn with loose rock and gravel, bordered on the far end by a rock face that the rotor blades would strike if she carried too much forward speed across the threshold. She adjusted. At 15 feet, the rotor wash was kicking up a storm of dust and debris that reduced her visibility to almost nothing. She flew by feel, by memory, by the accumulation of everything she had ever been taught and everything she had ever learned on her own in the space between what instructors taught and what combat actually required. The skids touched rock at 1941 hours. The contact was not a landing in any textbook sense of the word. It was a controlled collision, the skids hitting the canyon floor at a forward speed that sent the aircraft skidding across loose gravel in a grinding, sparking, shuddering progression that covered 30 meters before the main rotor blades reached the canyon wall on the right side. The blades struck rock and disintegrated in a sequence of explosive cracks that sounded like rifle fire echoing between the ridgelines. Fragments scattered across the canyon floor and into the darkness beyond. The fuselage lurched hard left as the rotor asymmetry resolved itself violently, the tail swinging wide and the left skid digging into the gravel, and finally, after everything, after the RPG and the spin, and the 17 minutes of impossible flight, and the 90-second approach into a canyon that had no business receiving a helicopter, the aircraft stopped. Complete stillness, the kind that follows catastrophic noise and feels almost hallucinatory in its totality. Vasquez sat in the cockpit and let the stillness exist for exactly 4 seconds. She was aware of the fuel smell. She was aware of the heat coming from the engine compartment behind the firewall. She was aware that the aircraft needed to be vacated immediately, and that the fuel smell in proximity to damaged electrical systems created a fire risk that the 4-second pause she was allowing herself was already pushing against. She was aware of all of this with the same clinical detachment she had maintained since the moment the RPG hit, the same detachment that had kept her hands moving and her voice steady, and her decisions sequential, rather than panicked across 17 of the most demanding minutes of her life. She turned and looked at Holt. She looked at him for 1 full second, not with grief, not yet, because grief was a weight she could not carry and still do what came next, but with something quieter and more permanent. A recognition, an acknowledgement. The kind a soldier gives to another soldier when words are insufficient and time is not available, and the only honest thing left is to see them clearly and carry that image forward. She looked at Reeves, the same second, the same silence, the same weight added to something she would have to carry later when later was available. Then she unbuckled her harness, checked that her sidearm was secured, pressed her right hand firmly against the shrapnel wound in her left shoulder, and pushed open the cockpit door. The cold Afghan night hit her immediately, sharp and thin at this altitude, carrying the smell of rock dust and the distant, faint trace of cordite on the wind. She stood beside the wreckage of the Black Hawk for 1 moment, and oriented herself by stars and terrain, and the last known coordinates of the Ranger team that were locked in her memory as precisely as they had been locked in the aircraft's navigation system. 12 kilometers on foot, at night, bleeding in enemy territory. She started walking. She moved through the darkness the way she had learned to move through every difficult thing in her life, without announcing herself, without requesting permission, and without entertaining the possibility that she would not reach the other side of it. The canyon floor gave way to a steep rocky incline that climbed northeast along the ridgeline, and she took it at a pace that was neither reckless nor cautious, but precisely calibrated to the intersection of urgency and sustainability. She could not afford to fall. A twisted ankle out here, alone at night, in hostile terrain with a bleeding shoulder and no aircraft and no backup, was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence written in the language of terrain and distance and time. So she placed every footstep with deliberate care, reading the ground through the thin sole of her flight boots, using her right hand against rock faces when the slope demanded it, and keeping her left arm pressed tight against her body to minimize movement in the damaged shoulder. The pain was significant. She did not pretend otherwise, even to herself. The shrapnel that had torn through the rear deltoid and lodged somewhere against the posterior scapula was not a clean wound. It burned with a deep, grinding persistence that spiked into something sharper every time she was forced to use the arm for balance on the steeper sections of the climb. She had field-dressed it minimally in the cockpit before leaving the aircraft, pressing a folded section of her flight suit against the entry point and securing it with the strap from the medical kit she had grabbed on her way out. It was not sufficient by any clinical standard. It was sufficient for the next hour, which was the only standard that currently applied. She had been walking for 23 minutes when she heard the first exchange of gunfire ahead, a short, disciplined burst from a suppressed rifle followed by two unsuppressed returns from an elevated position to the northeast. The Rangers were still engaged, still holding, still alive. The sound of it recalibrated something in her chest, sharpened her focus in the way that confirmation of a target sharpens a pilot's attention after a long search. The relief of knowing, combined immediately with the urgency of responding. She adjusted her heading by approximately 15 degrees and increased her pace on a section of relatively flat ground between two boulder clusters, her right hand moving to the grip of her sidearm, without conscious instruction from the thinking part of her brain. The Ranger position materialized out of the darkness gradually, the way defensive positions are designed to materialize, not as something visible from a distance, but as something you are almost upon before the geometry of it resolves itself into recognizable human arrangement. She saw the outline of a boulder cluster with angles that were slightly too deliberate to be purely geological. She saw the low, controlled movement of a figure-shifting position behind cover. She stopped. She assessed the sight lines. She identified the position of the sentry before the sentry identified her, which was itself a testament to how quietly she had covered the ground between the canyon and this ridgeline. She made a sound, low, controlled, the specific non-threatening sound that soldiers use to announce themselves to other soldiers in the dark, without announcing themselves to anyone else in the dark. A clipped, compressed vocalization that carried no further than it needed to. The sentry froze. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had been in combat long enough to know the difference between the sounds the mountain made on its own and the sounds the mountain made when something human was moving through it. He had heard her before he saw her, not footsteps exactly, more like the subtle displacement of air and gravel that a body in motion produces when it is trying to be quiet, but cannot entirely eliminate the physical evidence of its own existence. He had already shifted his rifle toward the sound before she made the signal. His finger was alongside the trigger guard, not on it, but close. The combat-ready compromise between readiness and restraint that separates trained soldiers from everyone else. Then his tactical light caught her. The beam found her face first, pale, set with an expression of absolute concentrated purpose, sweat-streaked and dust-covered. a dark stain spreading from the left shoulder of her flight suit down the sleeve in a way that left no ambiguity about what it was or how long it had been there. Her right hand was visible and open, away from her body, the sidearm holstered, a deliberate gesture of identification that she had made without breaking stride, because she had anticipated the moment and prepared for it the way she prepared for every moment, by thinking 3 steps ahead of where she currently stood. Webb lowered the rifle. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. In 3 combat deployments across 2 theaters of war, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had seen things that had permanently altered his understanding of what human beings were capable of, both the worst of it and the best of it. He was not a man given to speechlessness. He was known among his team for his ability to produce exactly the right words in exactly the right moment under exactly the wrong circumstances. But standing on that ridgeline in the dark, watching Captain Alara Vasquez walk out of the Afghan night toward him, bleeding, alone, on foot from a crash site that his team had heard and written off as unsurvivable, he could not locate a single word that was adequate to what he was seeing. She didn't wait for one. She looked past him to where his 2 wounded men were positioned behind the main boulder cluster, read their condition from 10 meters away with the rapid triage assessment of someone who had been doing this for years, and was already moving toward them before Webb had fully processed that she was real and present and standing in front of him. She dropped to her knees beside Corporal James Attaway first, the chest wound, the more immediately critical of the 2. Attaway was conscious but deteriorating, his breathing labored and asymmetrical in the way that indicated the chest seal applied in the field had shifted or lost integrity. Vasquez opened the medical kit she had carried from the aircraft with her right hand, located the chest seal by touch in near-total darkness, and worked with a focused efficiency that transformed the rocky ground beside a combat position in the Afghan mountains into something that functioned, against all reasonable expectation, like a trauma bay. 1 hand, minimal light, significant personal blood loss, complete professional composure. Webb crouched beside her and offered his light without being asked. She used it without thanking him, not from rudeness but from concentration, the kind of total absorption in a task that leaves no cognitive bandwidth for social formality. She placed the new chest seal, assessed the airway, checked the pulse, and moved to the second casualty, Private First Class Derek Solis, whose leg wound had been tourniqueted in the field but whose color and responsiveness told her the blood loss had been more significant than the tourniquet alone could fully address. She worked on Solis for 6 minutes. Webb watched her the entire time, his rifle up and his eyes moving between her hands and the ridgeline above them, providing security for a woman who was providing the only thing standing between 2 of his soldiers, and the thing waiting at the end of every combat wound that goes unaddressed long enough. When she finally sat back on her heels and looked up at him, both casualties stabilized, her assessment complete, her one functional hand dark with blood that was not entirely her own, Webb found the words he had been unable to locate earlier. They were not eloquent. They were not the words of a man who had prepared a speech. They were simply the truest thing available to him in that moment, spoken quietly and without performance into the cold Afghan dark. "How are you even here right now?" Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at her patients. Then she said, in the same calm, even tone she had used to talk herself through the cockpit of a dying helicopter at 4,000 feet. "Same reason you're still here, because leaving wasn't an option." Rescue helicopter was heard before it was seen, a distant rhythmic beating against the mountain air that grew from barely perceptible to unmistakable over the course of about 90 seconds, the sound of it moving through the dark like something purposeful and alive. Webb heard it first, the way he heard most things first, and he pressed the transmit button on his radio and gave the incoming crew the IR strobe position and the security status of the landing zone, with the clipped precision of a man who had called in enough extractions to do it in his sleep. The strobe went active 30 meters from the Ranger position. its infrared pulse invisible to the naked eye, but blazing like a beacon through the night vision equipment of the pilots banking toward them from the southwest. Vasquez heard the rotors and felt something shift inside her that she would not have been able to name precisely in that moment. It was not relief. Exactly. Relief implied that the danger was over, and she was experienced enough to know that the space between a helicopter arriving and a helicopter successfully extracting casualties with the enemy still present on the surrounding ridgelines was not a space in which relief was an appropriate physiological response. It was something quieter than relief and more fundamental. The recognition that the part of the night that had depended entirely on her alone was ending, and that other hands, competent and trained and fully functional in ways that her left arm was no longer, were about to take over the weight she had been carrying since 1921 hours. She did not allow herself to feel it fully. Not yet. There were still 2 patients who needed to be packaged and loaded, still a landing zone that needed to be managed, still a security situation that had not resolved itself simply because a rescue aircraft was inbound. She got to her feet slowly, because the blood loss and the cold and the hour of exertion had made her legs less reliable than she was accustomed to, and positioned herself beside it away to assist with the carry when the rescue team made ground contact. The Black Hawk came in low and fast and flared hard over the landing zone, the rotor wash hitting the Ranger position like a physical thing, scattering loose gravel and dust in every direction and flattening the sparse mountain vegetation against the rocky ground. It touched down with the controlled aggression of a crew that had been told the situation was critical and had flown accordingly, pushing speed and approach angle in ways that would have been inadvisable under less urgent circumstances and were entirely appropriate under these ones. The rescue team came off the aircraft at a run. 4 of them, 2 flight medics and 2 security personnel, moving with the rapid, practiced efficiency of people executing a task they had rehearsed so many times that the individual steps had dissolved into a single continuous motion. The lead medic, a staff sergeant named Carla Okonkwo, who had been doing this job for 6 years across 3 deployments, hit the ground scanning and assessing simultaneously, her eyes moving across the position with the speed of someone reading a language she had spent years learning to read fluently. She saw it away. She saw Solis. She saw the quality of the field treatment that had been applied to both of them, the correctly placed chest seal, the managed tourniquet, the airway positioning, and she registered it with the professional appreciation of someone who understood exactly how much skill and judgment those interventions represented, especially given the conditions under which they had been applied. Then she saw Vasquez. Okonkwo had been briefed during the flight on what the operations center knew, which was that Ghost's aircraft had been hit, that 2 crew members were confirmed dead, that the pilot had transmitted a broken mayday and then gone silent, and that the Ranger team on the ground had reported a single survivor walking out of the dark toward their position approximately 40 minutes after the explosion. She had processed this information professionally during the flight, integrating it into her medical planning the way she integrated all pre-mission intelligence, as data points that informed preparation without being permitted to generate emotional response before the work was done. Seeing it in person was different. Vasquez was standing beside Adaway's litter with her right hand resting on the frame, and her left arm held close against her body, her flight suit dark with dried blood from the shoulder wound down the entire length of the sleeve, her face carrying the particular quality of exhaustion that goes beyond physical tiredness into something that involves the whole person. The kind of exhaustion that accumulates not just in muscles and blood volume but in the sustained expenditure of will across an extended period of crisis. She was upright. She was present. Her eyes were clear and tracking and professionally engaged with the ongoing situation around her. She was, by every observable measure, still functioning. She was also, Okonkwo assessed in the first 3 seconds of seeing her, in serious need of immediate medical intervention that she had clearly been deferring for the better part of an hour. The stretcher came off the aircraft. Okonkwo moved it toward Vasquez with the directness of a medic who was not asking a question but delivering a clinical determination. Vasquez looked at the stretcher. She looked at Atue. She looked at Solis. She said, in a voice that carried no particular drama but also carried no ambiguity about its meaning, "Them first." Okonkwo held her gaze for a moment. Then she redirected the stretcher without argument, because there was something in the way Vasquez said it that placed the statement beyond the category of personal preference and into the category of operational priority. And because Okonkwo was experienced enough to recognize that arguing with it would cost more time than complying. Atue was loaded first. Solis was loaded second. The security personnel maintained the perimeter. Webb assisted with the carries, moving with the focused efficiency of a soldier completing the final tasks of a mission that had demanded everything he had and was now, finally, approaching its terminal point. It was when the second litter crossed the threshold of the aircraft door that something changed in the quality of the air on that landing zone. There was no single visible cause, no signal given, no word spoken, no gesture made. It was simply that the last critical task was complete, the last patient was loaded, and the sustained forward pressure of emergency and necessity that had been holding everything in place suddenly had nothing left to press against. Webb was standing 4 meters from the aircraft when it happened. He had been awake for 31 hours. He had kept 2 critically wounded men alive through 4 hours of enemy contact with limited ammunition and no medevac. He had watched a woman walk out of the Afghan dark from a crash site that physics said should have killed her, drop to her knees in the dirt, and save his soldiers with one hand. He was 28 years old and had seen more of the worst things human beings did to each other than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. His knees buckled. Not completely. He caught himself with one hand against the fuselage, the metal cold and real against his palm, but enough. Enough that the soldier standing beside him saw it and said nothing, because the soldier standing beside him had felt his own throat close in a way that made speech temporarily unavailable. 2 other Rangers turned away from the aircraft and faced the dark ridgeline with their rifles up, which was tactically correct, and also served the secondary purpose of giving their faces somewhere to be that wasn't visible to the people around them. The rescue medic who had been managing Solis' litter took 3 steps away from the aircraft, stopped with his back to everyone, and stood very still for a moment with his head slightly bowed. Nobody ordered any of this. Nobody could have stopped it. Okonkwo guided Vasquez to the aircraft with a hand under her right arm, not forcing, not pulling, simply present and supportive in the way that medical personnel learn to be present with patients who have been carrying too much for too long and need to be allowed to set it down without feeling that setting it down means they have failed. Vasquez walked the distance under her own power, as everyone who knew her would have predicted she would. At the threshold of the aircraft door, she paused 1 full second and looked back across the landing zone, at Webb's hand against the fuselage, at the ridgeline, at the darkness that stretched back southwest toward the canyon where the Black Hawk lay broken and silent with Holt and Reeves still inside it. Something moved across her face in that second. It was not grief, not yet, because grief still required a time and a place she hadn't arrived at, but it was the precursor to grief, the acknowledgement that when this was over, when the aircraft was back at the FOB and the casualties were in the surgical bay, and the debrief was done and the room was quiet, there would be a weight waiting for her that was not going to be managed or deferred or set aside. It would simply have to be carried. The way Rosa had carried things, the way she had always carried things. Then the moment passed. She turned and stepped into the aircraft. The door closed. The rotors increased to takeoff pitch. The Black Hawk lifted off the ridgeline and banked southwest into the dark mountain sky, carrying its wounded away from the place that had tried to keep them. On the ground below, Webb straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist. He looked at his remaining men, at their faces, at what was written on them, at the specific kind of emotion that has no clean name but lives in the space between relief and grief and awe and gratitude. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he keyed his radio and began the extraction report in the level, professional voice of a soldier completing his mission. His voice only broke once, just once, on the word Ghost Part 8, what she kept. Extended version, 700 words. She woke up in Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany on the third day, which was 2 days later than the surgical team had initially anticipated, and 1 day earlier than they had begun to fear might be the realistic outcome given the blood loss and the infection that had developed in the shoulder wound during the hours between the crash and the extraction. The room was white and quiet and smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, and for a moment, the specific disoriented moment that exists between unconsciousness and full wakefulness, before the brain has fully reassembled its understanding of where it is and why, she didn't know where she was. Then the pain in her shoulder informed her. Then the IV line in her right arm confirmed it. Then the memory arrived, not gently but all at once, the way significant memories always arrive when the brain has been holding them in suspension during unconsciousness and releases them the moment awareness returns. Holt Reeves, the canyon, the dark. She lay still for a long time after that, not sleeping, present, awake, breathing steadily in the white, quiet room while the full weight of everything she had been deferring since 1921 hours on that Afghan night settled onto her chest with the slow, inexorable patience of something that had always known it would eventually arrive and had simply been waiting for the appropriate moment. She did not fight it. She had learned enough about herself over the years to know that fighting this particular kind of weight accomplished nothing. It was not the kind of thing that could be outmaneuvered or outworked or left behind through sheer forward motion. It had to be sat with. It had to be acknowledged in full before it would agree to become manageable. She cried once briefly on the morning of the fourth day, when the hospital chaplain came to inform her formally that the recovery team had reached the crash site, and that Sergeant Damon Holt and Specialist Tanya Reeves had been recovered with full military honors, and were being transported home to their families. She had known this was coming. She had known since the moment she stepped out of that cockpit and started walking that this notification existed somewhere ahead of her in time, waiting to be received. Knowing it was coming did not make receiving it easier. It simply made it something she had been able to prepare for, and preparation was the only form of control available to her in this particular situation, so she had used it fully. The chaplain sat with her for 40 minutes. She didn't talk much. He didn't require her to. The physical recovery took 6 weeks. The shoulder required 2 surgeries, the first to remove the shrapnel fragment that had lodged against the posterior scapula, the second to repair the rotator cuff damage that the fragment had caused on its way through the tissue. The physical therapist assigned to her was a former Army Ranger medic named Specialist Torres, who had seen enough combat injuries to know the difference between patients who would push too hard too fast out of impatience and patients who would push too hard too fast out of something more purposeful. He identified Vasquez as the second category within the first session and calibrated his approach accordingly, giving her enough resistance to satisfy the need to be working towards something without allowing her to compromise the surgical repairs before they had time to consolidate. She was a difficult patient in the specific way that highly capable, highly self-sufficient people are always difficult patients, not uncooperative, not resistant to instruction, but fundamentally uncomfortable with the experience of being the person who needed care rather than the person providing it. Torres noted in his records that she consistently underreported pain levels and consistently overestimated her functional capacity at each assessment point. He also noted that she was the most focused and disciplined rehabilitation patient he had worked with in 4 years of the job, and that her recovery timeline, while aggressive, was entirely consistent with what someone of her physical conditioning and psychological determination could realistically achieve. She was cleared for limited duty at 5 weeks. She requested return to flight status at 6. The ceremony was held in the hospital courtyard on a Tuesday morning in October, under a sky the color of pale silver, with a cold wind coming off the Rhine Valley that made the flag snap, and the dress uniforms press flat against the chests of the people wearing them. The Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor was presented by a 2-star general who had flown Medevac missions himself in an earlier decade and understood, at a level beyond ceremony and citation, what the medal in his hand represented. He read the citation aloud in the measured, deliberate cadence of someone who wanted every word to land with the weight it carried. The RPG strike, the 2 crew members lost, the 17 minutes of solo flight in a critically damaged aircraft, the controlled landing in an unsurvivable canyon, the foot movement through hostile terrain to the Ranger position, the one-handed trauma care that kept 2 critically wounded soldiers alive until extraction. The courtyard was completely silent while he read, not the polite silence of ceremony, the deeper silence of people who were hearing something that exceeded their existing framework for what a person could do and were adjusting that framework in real time. The 4 Rangers were all present. Adaway arrived in a wheelchair, his chest still wrapped, his color better than it had been on that canyon floor, but still carrying the pale, careful quality of someone whose body was in the middle of serious repair work. Solis walked on crutches, his leg reconstructed through 2 surgeries that the trauma surgeons at Bagram had performed in the hours after the extraction. The other 2 Rangers, the ones who had been combat effective that night, who had maintained the perimeter and kept the position, and made the landing zone possible, stood in their dress uniforms with the particular stillness of soldiers at formal attention, which is different from ordinary stillness in the way that it contains within it the full weight of what the person wearing the uniform has seen and done and carried. Webb stood at the end of the Ranger line. He had driven 4 hours from the base where his team was currently stood down for the ceremony, arriving the previous evening and spending the night in the hospital guest quarters. He had pressed his uniform himself. He had polished his boots to a standard that suggested he had been working on them since approximately 5 in the morning. When the general pinned the medal to Vasquez's chest, Webb was looking at her face rather than the medal, and what he saw there, the composure, the steadiness, the slight tightening around her eyes that was the only visible concession to what the moment cost her, confirmed everything he had believed about her since the night she had walked out of the dark toward his position with her shoulder torn open, and her patience already her first priority. When the ceremony concluded, and the formal elements dissolved into the quieter human interactions that always follow military ceremonies, Webb made his way to her through the small crowd of medical staff and unit representatives, and found her standing slightly apart from the main group in the way she always seemed to stand, present but not performing presence, engaged but not requiring acknowledgement. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him. Something passed between them that had been established on a canyon floor in Afghanistan and did not require rehearsal or explanation in a German hospital courtyard. He said what he had told the press the previous day, because it was the truest thing he had, and he wanted her to hear it directly rather than through a reporter's filtered version. She came back for us when she had every reason not to. That's the whole story. Vasquez looked at him for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Holt and Reeves came with me. Don't forget that part." Webb nodded. He wouldn't. That evening, after the ceremony and the visitors and the formal obligations of the day had concluded, Vasquez sat alone on a wooden bench in the hospital garden as the last light drained from the sky above the Rhine Valley. She was still in her dress uniform, the Distinguished Flying Cross on her chest catching what remained of the daylight in small, precise reflections. Her left shoulder ached with the persistent, manageable ache of something that had been seriously damaged and was genuinely healing. The honest pain of repair rather than the sharp pain of crisis, and she had learned over the past 6 weeks to receive it as information rather than complaint. A transport helicopter crossed the sky overhead, its navigation lights blinking green and red against the darkening silver. She tracked it with her eyes the way she always tracked aircraft, automatically, professionally, with the deep-seated attention of someone for whom flying was not a job performed in working hours, but a fundamental orientation toward the world. She watched it until it passed beyond the tree line at the far edge of the hospital grounds, and the sound of its rotors faded into the general quiet of the evening. She looked down at her hands. The left one had regained approximately 80% of its pre-injury grip strength. Tors had informed her that morning. The remaining 20% would come back with time and continued work. She flexed the fingers slowly, feeling the pull of the surgical repair against the movement, noting the improvement since the previous week with the same clinical attention she brought to everything. She thought about Holt. She thought about Reeves. She thought about Rosa in San Antonio, working a double shift the night her daughter had flown a dying helicopter into a canyon and walked out the other side, unaware that any of it was happening. She thought about Itawe's breathing steadying under her hands on that dark ridgeline. She thought about the sound of rotors, always the sound of rotors, the thing that had pulled her forward since she was 16 years old, standing too close to an air show barrier with blistered hands and a certainty that had never wavered. She had already submitted the paperwork for return to flight status. Tors had signed off. The surgical team had signed off. The only remaining signature was the flight surgeon's, scheduled for the following Thursday. She was not afraid of going back. She had examined that question honestly, in the white quiet of the recovery room during the long hours when the hospital was dark and the ward was silent and the only company available was her own mind and its contents. And she had found, beneath all the grief and the loss and the weight of what the night in Afghanistan had taken from her, that the thing which had always oriented her toward the sky was still there, unchanged, patient, waiting for her to heal enough to return to it. She was not the same person who had lifted off from Fob Kestrel at 1903 hours on that Afghan evening. She understood that clearly and did not pretend otherwise. She carried Holt and Reeves now in the specific way that soldiers carry their dead, not as a burden that prevents forward movement, but as a presence that accompanies it, a weight that does not diminish but that becomes, over time, integrated into the way a person moves through the world rather than opposed to it. She would go back. She would fly again. She would answer the next distress call before the briefing finished, the way she always had, because that was who she was and no canyon in Afghanistan had changed it. She stood up from the bench. The Rhine Valley was dark now, the sky above it deepening toward full night, the first stars beginning to appear with the quiet persistence of things that have always been there and will continue to be there long after the particular human dramas unfolding beneath them have resolved themselves one way or another. She straightened her uniform. She touched the metal once, briefly, with her right hand, not proudly, not performatively, but with the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understands that the thing the metal represents belongs not entirely to her, but to everyone who was present that night, including the two who did not come home. Then she walked back inside.